The import wizard works for up to 50,000 records. You can choose whether you trigger workflow rules and processes. In my testing, I have not seen the same behavior with record triggered flow. So I would still be mindful to turn those off yourself if you're working with the import wizard. Why might I choose it? Well, it has this nice built-in duplicate prevention. So I can select a matching type. If I'm loading contacts into the system, you already exist in my system as a contact with the same email, it won't import you a second time. And sometimes that happens. Sometimes duplicate contact records, duplicate leads get imported. So really nice benefit of the import wizard is the ability to prevent duplicates. But guess what? The import wizard does not work for all objects. So first thing to keep in mind, only import operations, no export, no delete, only works for a limited set of objects. You choose how you remember these, but my colleague remembers, she thinks of Anchorman where he says, stay classy. She thinks of C, class, only one S, C class C. That stands for custom objects, contacts, leads, accounts, solutions, which are just in classic. It's like the classic older version of knowledge, and campaign members. Custom objects, contacts, leads, accounts, solutions, and campaign members, C class C. If you need to work with an object and it is not listed here, the import wizard is not your tool. And yes, I would memorize these for the exam. The exam will never try to trick you, but they will try to assess if you know the objects that this supports. So that's the import wizard, importing new. Then we have two tools, Data Loader and Data Loader IO. And we actually just have Data Loader pictured here. This is a client application that you download and install on your team. I'm sorry, not on your team, on your, I don't know what I were Windows. And it performs the same type of operations that the import wizard does. It can insert, it can update, it can upsert. But look what else it can do. It can delete and it can export. And then export all also grabs stuff from the recycle bin. It's truly all of your data, including what's in the recycle bin. It also works for a lot more data, can work with a lot more data, up to 5 million records, 5 million records at once. Can be helpful to get Salesforce IDs. You can save your field mappings, so it's easier to perform a data update in the future. And guess what? It is not limited by object. Import wizard is, this is not. So if I need to work with other objects, opportunities, cases, users, really any object that was not listed on the import wizard slide, that's when I turn to Data Loader. It does not have the easy built-in duplicate prevention, but otherwise I would say more situations than not, you're turning to Data Loader because it's more flexible in what it can do. It can do a lot more for us. Let's get through a few more slides and we'll take our last break. Some best practices. Some of these may seem like common sense, but just as a reminder. If we are loading data into custom fields, those fields need to exist in the system first. So create the fields first. Always clean up your data before you put it in the system. Never knowingly put bad data into the system. I always think when I work with data, I probably spend 80% of my time cleaning it up, the other 20% actually working with the import wizard or data loader. Avoid duplicates by exporting record ID fields. We can use the proper matching type if we're working with the import wizard. We can use an external ID if we're working with data from the third-party system. That would be those external relationships that we saw earlier. And always recommend preparing and uploading a test batch first. So I do a few records and make sure I didn't accidentally fire off any emails that I didn't mean to. I check that with the email log and then I try more data to make sure things are going well. If we can avoid it, this is harder in global orgs. We want to not perform updates to data during regular business hours when other people could be updating the same records. Again, a global org, it's hard to avoid this completely, but we shoot for off-peak times. If automation is set up, we want to see, do we want to fire this? I have a real fear of inadvertently firing some automation that I don't mean to. So I always check to see, is this going to kick off a process? Is it going to kick off a flow that I don't want it to kick off? And I may need to manually deactivate it for the period that I do my import or my update. We are going to skip this. We still have a decent amount of slides to cover, and I want to give us another quick break. This is just importing data into the system. You're welcome to practice with the import wizard in a Trailhead playground, but I'm going to skip this just to make up a little bit of time. But I don't want to skip these because I think it is helpful practice for our questions. So let's get through. Yeah, let's do these questions, and then we'll go ahead and take our last break, and then we'll come back and wrap up our last few lessons. Question number 1. NTO needs to export 50 open opportunities. What tool would you use? 50 open opportunities we need to export. So the only tool of the ones that we talked about is Data Loader. Exporting, it's definitely not the import wizard. Opportunities are also not supported by the import wizard. Again, the exam will not try to trick you, but you might start to read a couple details that make you think it's one tool, and then there will be a third detail that means it has to be the other tool. So read all the details. I know you all will anyway. Question number 2. An admin needs to import 2,000 leads without triggering workflow rules. Again, if you have any active workflow rules, we do in my org. We're in the process of figuring out a plan. Import 2,000 leads without triggering workflow rules. That would be the import wizard. So leads work for the import wizard, less than 50,000, and just doing an import, and I don't want to trigger workflow rules or processes, that is import wizard. This third one we didn't talk about, so let's see if y'all can get it. NTO would like to import 50 new accounts and their associated contacts into Salesforce from CSV files. What records should they import first? So I've got contacts, I've got accounts. What do I want to start with? I want to start with accounts. Because once I have the accounts, then I can get the IDs of those accounts. I can export them. I can match them up with my contacts and use them to create those relationships, to create the association. So contacts get tied to the right accounts. Okay, everyone, let's take our last break. And I'm going to say, I think we can get through what we need to get through in about an hour and a half. So let's just do 10 minutes. It is 22 minutes after the hour, so that's 12:22 Pacific. We'll come back at 33 minutes after the hour. So about 10 minutes, 12:33 Pacific is when we will return. Take about 10 minutes, step away. We have a little bit more to cover when we get back. See you all in 10 minutes, 33 minutes after the hour. Data and store it wherever your company stores that backed up data. So data export service, if you're really looking for a complete set, other two options would generally be a subset of your data. I know it's cut off again, but I know what Rose is asking. She said, hey, we successfully backed up our data. How can we be confident that new data is entered accurately and completely? One of those ways that we can do this is with validation. And I say one of the ways because there are other tools that we can use to help with data quality. Automation can help with data quality, lookup filters, stuff like that. But often, traditionally, we think of enforcing it with data validation. And there's two main forms of data validation. There's system validation, which runs first, very first thing that's checked in the order of execution. Then later, there's custom validation. Custom validation runs a little bit later, and it has to do with rules that we write ourselves to enforce things more conditionally. So system validation runs first. It has to do with the data type of the field. If you have a currency field, I can't type in text into that field if it doesn't match. Has to do with whether a field is required on the field itself or whether we've said it's a unique field. So email, text, and number, those fields can be unique, and that's another option for duplicate prevention. So again, I'll use email as an example. You exist in my system already as a lead. Someone tries to add you again as a lead with the same email address. It prevents you from saving because we said the email has to be unique. When we write a custom validation rule, it is written in the form of a Boolean statement. So it's a statement that evaluates to be true or false. And when it evaluates to be true is when we stop our user from saving. And this took me a while to kind of wrap my head around for validation. I always wanted to write the formula based on what I do want them to do, but you're actually writing the formula based on what you don't want them to do. So here we have a scenario where we don't want our sales users entering an opportunity discount greater than 20%. So we have this user, he's typing into an opportunity, and he types in a discount of 25%. And then it evaluates the formula. Every time I write a custom validation rule in my head, I think, don't let my user save if. Don't let my user save if the discount percentage is greater than 20. And if it is, we stop them from saving and we show them a custom error message. We write this ourselves. It should be clear, it should be concise, and it should be kind to your end users, telling them what they need to fix. So writing it with a Boolean statement, when it's true is when we stop them from saving. When it's true is when we show them the error. That was quite brief on custom validation. I know that's one example. Let me give you a couple more. Maybe you want to conditionally require certain fields as opportunities advance to later stages. Maybe you don't want your sales reps backdating the close date of the opportunity. Or we take the example from our scenario before. If a salesperson says, yes, they have a support plan, then we'll also enforce that they enter the expiration date for the support plan. A couple other examples of custom validation. Here's Rose again, another request, or really a heads up, I guess. CloudKicks has records in their database that already exist in NTO's org. These include several account and contact records. So there are other kind of simple tools that we can use to manage data, even beyond the import wizard and data loader. They're not nearly as robust in the functionality that they can provide, but they are pretty simple and straightforward to use. And these two tools are called mass delete and mass transfer. Mass delete and mass transfer. And the interface, the functionality is very similar, except for one of them deletes records and the other transfers ownership. So if we need to delete records, maybe we loaded some leads into the system, we shouldn't have loaded them in, we want to delete them. We will be given a list of records that will be deleted, and it will let us know what happens with associated records. So for example, if I go to mass delete leads, it lets me know any activities tied to those leads will also get deleted. When I perform a delete, it sends the deleted records to the recycle bin, and they live there for up to 15 days. And I say up to 15 days because the recycle bin also has a storage limit. Last I checked, it was 25 times your regular storage limit. So, probably not something that you are hitting very easily or frequently, but something to be mindful of. There is an option when you mass delete to check a box that says permanently delete. And if you do that, it skips the recycle bin and, as it implies, it does a permanent delete. Otherwise, they go to the recycle bin. Mass transfer, what we see described on the right-hand side of the slide and depicted in that little screenshot, allows me to transfer ownership of multiple records from one user to another. So I use this often when I worked for a Salesforce customer and we had to transfer ownership of accounts. So if a salesperson left the organization, they own accounts. We need to figure out who owns these accounts in the future. And once I determine that, usually with guidance from their manager, then I would mass transfer those accounts. So both of these tools allow you to transfer up to 250 records at once. And technically, I could come in and I could click delete again and I could click transfer again. I've done that with mass transfer because I didn't realize that I had more than 250 records that I was working with. When you mass transfer, you might transfer it from one person to another person, or maybe you're doing kind of a rearrangement, or a reorg of accounts and who owns them. You might leave transfer from as a blank field and then just transfer to one person based on criteria. So maybe I don't fill in the transfer from, I do fill in the transfer to, and then I set criteria. I'm going to find all accounts in the retail industry in the state of Washington. And that's the criteria that I set to transfer them. So nice option, especially if you're working with like a decent amount of data, but not a ton of data. Another quiz on data management tools. So it could be some tools we just described or what we learned about earlier. Question number 1. NTO would like to perform an automatic backup of all Salesforce data once a week. So what are you looking for here? Automatic, all, once a week. What does that sound like? That one is probably, again, depending on your edition, probably describing this data export service. So that's the one you run it, gets all your data. You can include files, you can include images, all of your data, and you get it from the zip file and save it wherever you store that data. Number 2, admin wants to back up the manufacturing industry accounts in her organization before she begins a large import. Ooh, this is a smart admin in case something goes wrong. What tool or tools could she use? Back up manufacturing industry accounts before she begins a large import. One tool would be Data Loader. She could also export a report. Either one would make sense in this case. Number 3, for CloudKick's cases where product equals other, support representatives must enter a value in the product description custom field in order to create a case. So what we're saying is if you select other, then you need a product description populated. What does this one sound like? That one is a custom validation rule. So again, system validation, data type of the field. Is it required? Is it unique? Custom validation is more used to enforce things conditionally. Custom validation rule. Number 4, admin incorrectly imported a set of records into Salesforce. What tool or tools can they use to remove the records from Salesforce? data loader, the IO version of data loader, and depending on the object, mass delete. I think I forgot to mention this. Mass delete, mass transfer don't work for all objects. I know I recommended that you memorize the objects that the import wizard supports. I wouldn't be too focused on it for mass transfer, mass delete. Know that they don't work for all objects. So if it's supported, you can use mass delete here. Okay, next request from Rose. Let's see what she's looking at this time. So this portion of the exam is data management and it's analytics. We've tackled the data management piece. Now we're moving on to analytics. Rose said we want to make sure CloudKicks is familiar with analytics functionality in Salesforce. Can you run through the basics of designing reports and dashboards with them? This is one of those questions. We have a few questions in our slides. What are reports? What are flow? Or what is flow? They're so broad, but reports are simply ways to analyze or aggregate your data, bring your data together, answer questions about your data, organize it differently, perform calculations. And when we work with reports in Salesforce, we can create them from scratch using available report types, or maybe you have another report. Someone else created it, you got it from a package. Maybe it's something from, I don't know, a past analysis. You can use that as a starting point. When you create a report, you can save it in a custom folder that we create, a private folder that only you have access to, or it can be saved in a public folder. So on the left-hand side of my screenshot are kind of my categories for reports, and one of them is public reports. This tends to be kind of like a catch-all for reports that don't get neatly categorized other places. I've been guilty of dumping reports here, but in general, we want to try to put it in a custom report to keep it better organized. After we create a report, we can override it, continue to make changes, or delete it if it's no longer needed. Maybe it's a report that people haven't run in a long time, and we're doing a reporting cleanup. This cut off, but it says creating a custom report, questions to ask. So before we get into these questions, and I think they're important, what I want you to think about is the difference between two terms. A custom report is what we create if I were to go into the front end of my tool and go to my reports tab and create a new report. I am creating a custom report. Well, I will be once my org loads. So I select a report type, object or objects that I'm reporting on, and I'm creating a custom report. A custom report type, on the other hand, is created in setup. So custom report front end of the tool, custom report type is created in setup. We'll go back to that in a minute. Now, why do we ask these questions? Well, when I was a new admin, my boss said, hey, why don't you handle our report requests for us? People would come to me and they'd say, hey, can you give me a report of my team's opportunities? And what I did not do was ask enough questions. I would say, sure, I'll send it to you later. And then I would send it. And then they might say, well, I'd like to see this. And can we add up this? And can we also pull in this information? And there was more back and forth because I wasn't asking enough questions at the beginning, wasn't asking enough questions to begin with. So you don't necessarily have to ask all of these, but asking these questions can help you form what you want the report to look like and what the ultimate goal of this report should be. First question is the report type. First thing we select when you saw me do a demo. What object or objects are you reporting on? Accounts, leads with activities, cases with something. Cases, those are report types, object or objects. Then whose records? What time frame? Do you want all records all time, or do you want to narrow that down? I know it says what columns. You might also ask, what fields do you care about? What fields do you want to see on your report? Format has to do with the way that your data is displayed. And I've talked about a few commonly confused terms. I think report types and report formats are sometimes confused. Report type is the object or objects that I am reporting on. Report format is how the data is displayed. So our simplest type of format is just a list. It's tabular. No groupings at all, just your list of records, kind of like we would see in a list view. We can have it grouped by rows for a summary formatted report, grouped by rows and columns for a matrix formatted, or include blocks of data where each block kind of functions like its own report type within the report, and that would be a joined formatted report. So format the way that the data is organized or displayed. Groupings. So if we choose a summary grouping or a matrix grouping, what fields do we want to group by? Do we want to see accounts by industry, cases by product, something like that? And then for numerical fields, do we want to display those as subtotals, as grand totals? And we can choose to add additional filters. This allows us to really control and narrow down the records that we include on our report. And then the last one, highlights and charts, asks about that visual aspect. Do we want to add conditional highlighting, kind of themes of colors? Or do we want to add a chart to visualize that data? So again, you may not ask every question each time, but helps you get a better idea as far as a direction for the report. This is important. So we're going to bring back everyone's favorite topic, security, a couple times when we talk about reports and dashboards. When I click on a report and I run it in the interface, let's say I run a report of opportunities. The opportunities that I see on that report will only be the opportunities that I have access to based on my whole security and access setup. So everything we talked about when it comes to security in our first lesson today, which wasn't that long ago, but it might feel like a long time ago. Everything we talked about with security controls what users see when they click on a report to run it. So if you only have access to your own accounts and you run a report for all accounts, you'll only see your own. That's all your security allows you to see. So that's what you see on reports. We're going to come back to what you see on dashboards. Now, how do you access the reports themselves or the dashboards themselves? Reports and dashboards are not only stored in folders, folders are actually used to control access to the reports and dashboards themselves. So how do you get access to a report or to a dashboard? Well, you need to be given access to the folder where that report or dashboard is housed. So we see a folder here. Maybe this is our global sales folder, and we can choose to share it with individual users, roles and subordinates, or public groups. And when we share it with someone or a group of people, we can give them different levels of access. Lowest is view. You can run reports in this folder. You can save your own copy, but you cannot make any modifications. You can't overwrite the reports in this folder. That's pretty safe to give. Edit is a little bit scarier to me. You can run reports. You can overwrite changes to my reports. And then manage allows you to do the same things that view and edit can. Plus, you can control access to this folder for others. You can share it, which is what we're seeing here. So view, edit, manage is how we control access to the reports in the folder, or we would do the same thing for dashboards in a folder. I mentioned this before, but it's an important one. Report types. The object or objects plural that we are reporting on. Opportunities with products, leads with activities, accounts, activities by themselves. That's not what it's called. It's just called activities. But you get the idea. It's the object or objects that we are reporting on. It controls the fields that we can include. The default columns when we first create the new report utilizing this report type, the default filters, and the filters that I can include, all controlled by the report type that I select. What can we do to customize reports? So when we start with our report, we might adjust the default filters. Maybe I want to see all opportunities whose close date is in the current fiscal quarter. Then I can add up to 20 additional filters of my own. I want to see those whose type is existing business, whose lead source is trade show, or whose lead source is advertisement. When I add these additional filters, it defaults to treat them with and logic. This filter, and this filter, and this filter. But sometimes I want to change that. So I can modify the filter logic. I might say 1 and 2 or 3. 1 and 2 or 3, not 4. So and or not are the ways that I can customize that filter logic. I can also group data together in what we call buckets. Buckets allow me to kind of categorize the data on my report. So maybe we want to categorize opportunities into small, medium, and large opportunities. You can do that with buckets. And we can count the number of distinct values with a unique count. So a lot we can do to customize these reports and really get a clear analysis of our data. Choosing a chart type. Now, this slide is nice. It gives you some recommendations for what chart type is fitting for the type of data or type of analysis that you're doing. And there are certain times where one chart type is a better choice for displaying your data than other types. Other times it's your preference. It's just a matter of opinion. So let's look at some of the recommendations. Yes, this recommends a horizontal bar for comparing many items and a vertical bar for fewer items over time. Between these two, I think sometimes it's a judgment call. Sometimes you get to make that call. Line is good if you're tracking over time. And what we see in the top right-hand corner is a stacked bar chart. So when you're working with report charts, you actually have a couple options for what we call combination charts. Stacked bar, so one bar on top of another, comparing multiple values side by side. You could do a side-by-side bar, or you could do a line on bar. Those are your types of combination charts. A donut is shares of a total. And by the way, this is one that I would say you want to be a little bit more specific in choosing it. Shares of a total. A donut is going to be the best choice to show that. In this image, we see all of our opportunities, what share of all of the amounts comes from each of our different reps. Opportunities by rep, shares of a total. If we have a life cycle field, stages, statuses, like we talked about with our business process in our earlier lesson, those are really good to show as a funnel. So funnel, it says sales process, but it could be a life cycle field. And then a scatter plot, what we see in the bottom right, is helpful for correlation. And another quiz on our report types, and then we'll talk about what we can do with reports and dashboards. I think we're doing well on time, everyone. So at least one appropriate report chart type to display the following information. First one, we are trying to display which product categories brought in the most revenue this quarter. Which product categories brought in the most revenue this quarter? I'm going to say, oh, I can never remember this. I have to go back a minute. How we spell donut here. We do it with a D-O-N-U-T. So probably best one for this one is going to be donut. Not that the other donut spelling would be incorrect. Donut, we could probably do this one as a bar chart as well, but this one sounds like shares of a total. Question number 2, a comparison of revenue coming in from different sales teams over time. Revenue from different sales teams over time. We could maybe do a line here. Maybe, oh, that's not how you spell line. A line here. Maybe this would be a good time for a combination chart. So we could do a line on bar, which we didn't see pictured on the last one, but I mentioned it, a line on top of a bar, maybe kind of track a rolling average. Finally, number 3, a sales team. Oh, we want to track a sales team's progress as they move leads from a trade show throughout the sales process. So we start as a lead, moving leads from the trade show throughout the process. So here we have a sales process, we have a life cycle. I would say funnel is going to be our best here. Funnel is going to be our best option for that life cycle display. Okay, what can we do with reports and dashboards? Well, once we have reports and dashboards set up in our org, we can choose to subscribe to them. And what we're looking at is setting up a report subscription. So we can set this up to run daily, weekly, monthly, and we can choose when we want to receive it. So it looks like in this screenshot, we're choosing to run it weekly and get it every Monday. But maybe it's something you want to get every day. You can choose when you want that to be sent. Then we set our preferred start time. And I say preferred because it actually runs within 30 minutes of this time. So if I select 12 o'clock p.m., that is in my time zone, the time zone of the person setting up the report subscription, and it runs within 30 minutes of this time that I select. Who do we want to send the results to? Well, often I set up a report subscription just for myself. I have one where if my hours tracking is below 40 hours for the week, it sends it just to me. We can also send it to other people, but they have to be people who already have access to the folder where this report is housed. Again, folders really are the things that control access to the reports and dashboards themselves. So if I'm sending it to someone else, if I have the permission to do that, the only other people I can send it to are people who already have access to this report folder where it's stored. Now, when we set up a report subscription, there's a very important question that we need to answer. And it's very small on my screenshot on the left-hand side of my slide. But it says run report as. Run report as. And this is referring to a concept that we call a running user. This applies in the context of a report subscription. It also applies when we have a dashboard. So there's a running user of a dashboard as well. Run report as, or run dashboard as, view dashboard as. What this really refers to is we're asking a question. We're saying from whose perspective are we viewing this data? So if I say we're going to run this report as another person is Sarah Briggs, our VP of Global Sales, what we're saying is from whose perspective are we viewing this data in the emailed version of the report? So in the emailed version, if I send this out to all my salespeople, they might actually see more data in the emailed version than they would see if they ran the same exact report in Salesforce. But it only applies in the emailed version. If they click on the link to go view the report back in Salesforce, then their regular security takes back over. So run report as, we're taking the lens of that person from their security perspective, and that's the level of data that people see in the emailed version of the report. Could be more data or less data than they normally see in the system. Run report as. I'm going to come back to that concept when we talk about dashboards. I know you can't respond via chat, but play along with me if you want. Think about your dashboard in your car. What does your car's dashboard show you? I ask this question in a lot of my classes, and I get pretty reliably the same answers. My fuel level, my speed, my temperature level, any errors I might have. Mine shows me what music I'm playing, something like that. Well, a dashboard in Salesforce works in a very similar way. It gives you information at a glance, and it comes from various places in Salesforce. Similarly, on your car's dashboard, probably doesn't come all from the same place. It comes from different places throughout your car. So we have this information at a glance, and each one of these dashboard components, we can have up to 20 of them. Each one of these dashboard components can display information from a different report. They can be different report types. So everyone has what we call a source report that lives behind it. And like we set the running user of a report just in a report subscription, because when someone clicks on a report in the system, they only see the data they would normally see. But with a dashboard, we always have a running user. Who do we view the dashboard as? Concept is the same. From whose perspective are we viewing this data? When we look at a dashboard, it's only going to show data as of the last time it was refreshed. So these dashboards, if they have 20 components, each component could have a pretty big report that lives behind it. Could take a while to load. So they don't refresh every time you click on them. Instead, you can click the refresh button. And if it's a dashboard that has a single running user, it's refreshed for everyone who has access to it. So we do need to click refresh on the dashboards. If we want everyone to view data from their own perspective on the dashboard, we can make it what we call a dynamic dashboard. So we say, okay, who do we view this dashboard as? Well, the same person who's viewing it. It's not one person, it's not me, the admin user. Everyone sees it from their own perspective. And from this dashboard, I have all these little links. It says view report, sample report this, sample report this. These would be your own reports. You can click on those links to drill into them from the dashboard itself. Now, when we use source reports to display visually on a dashboard, when we use source reports to feed our dashboard components, we need to use reports that have groupings. The only way to display a tabular report on a dashboard is as a table component. Otherwise, if we want to show charts, we want to show things like our gauge and our metric, we need to use either a summary formatted report or a matrix formatted report. So summary formatted is what we see here, has groupings by rows only. Matrix would have groupings by rows and by columns. So we're relying on those groupings and the subtotals to actually display the data on the dashboard. And that's what this is focused on. Where is this information coming from? Well, what are we showing on the chart? We're showing information drawing from the groupings and from the subtotals on the report. Opportunities by rep, I can display that on the dashboard because my report is a summary formatted report grouped by opportunity owner. The sales pipeline, the amount, oh, well, these are the subtotals. The subtotals of the amount by my opportunity owner. Having those groupings is what I can use for displaying the data. These two components that we see at the bottom, a gauge component and a metric component. Gauge is the one that looks like a gas gauge. Metric is a single key number. Gauge and metric get their information from the grand total at the bottom of the report. So table can come from a tabular report. My groupings and subtotals generally feed my charts. Gauge and metric come from the grand totals at the bottom of the report. Running user. I know you've heard this a couple times. This is the last time we'll see it. We'll do a couple questions and then we'll move on to our automation. Running user. So again, this is like a broad term that we use. How it actually shows up in the interface. In a report subscription, on the left-hand screenshot, it says run report as. On the right-hand screenshot, on a dashboard, it says view dashboard as. But the concept around security is largely the same. So who do we run the report as? From whose perspective do we view the data in the emailed version of this report? On the right-hand side, who do we view the dashboard as? From whose perspective do we view the dashboard when we're looking at the dashboard regularly in the system? If they click the link to drill into that data. So if they click the link to actually view the report, their regular security takes back over. Just talking about from the dashboard itself. So another way I like to think of it is if I set myself as the running user, that's me, the person creating the dashboard, or me, the person setting up the report subscription. If I select me, it's as though I'm getting up out of my chair, you're sitting in my chair, and you're seeing the same data that I would see. Goes back to your whole security setup. From whose perspective do we view the data? Let's talk about accessing them. First one's a long one. NTO uses a private data model for accounts, and sales reps only have access to accounts that they own. Sales director wants to automatically send all sales representatives a report showing all currently open opportunities and their amounts by account each week. So there's a few pieces here. Let's break it down. So they only have access to accounts that they own. That's kind of our baseline for security. How do we automatically send them a report showing all open opportunities and their amounts? I think we might need to rework this scenario. So let's replace accounts with opportunities. Private data model will say 4 opportunities. And I know I could type that out, but I'm just going to draw it with my mouse. So we want to show them all currently open opportunities, regardless of whether they own them. Regardless of our mismatch of objects. What do you all think we would do here? Hopefully you're thinking that we need a report subscription. And we need to define the running user of the report. Run report as, we would say someone else. Maybe the director is the person who we run the report as. The director is the person from whose perspective we view the data. We view the data from the director's perspective. We can probably do that. Other thing to keep in mind is these people need to have access to the folder where that report is housed. Let's look at the next one. Could the sales director show this same data to representatives using a dashboard component? This one's a little bit trickier. I would say it's more of a gray area. I'm going to give my favorite Salesforce answer, and maybe you gave the same one. It depends. So in theory, we could do maybe a table component and pull some of that same information in as a table component. Might not be all the same data. Otherwise, most of our dashboard components are a little bit higher level, so it's not going to be quite that level of detail. That one was a tricky one. Okay, everyone, let's see how we're doing on our pacing. We have some more links here, again in the FAQs. We have a lesson on automation. And then we just have conclusion and next steps. So we're doing great. We just have to get through automation. It's about 20 slides or so. Then we will get to our final steps, talking about the exam in general, and we will wrap up. Thanks for sticking with me, everyone. Workflow and process automation. So not the most significant, but I would say a higher percentage on the exam, 16%. Given a scenario, what's the automation solution based on capabilities of the tool? Now, most of the time, a tool we're going to use in real life is going to be Flow. Capabilities and use cases for Flow. On the exam, there may still be questions about workflow and process builder. Even though those are not tools that we can create new workflows or new processes today, you may have existing workflow rules, existing processes that are active and still automating in your org. So they're not completely phased out of the exam based on what I'm being told. I would still not have them be a focus. We'll see a couple slides on them. We won't want to spend a lot of time on them. And then very high level capabilities and use cases for an approval process. What declarative automation tools do we have available? Well, we've already talked about a lot of these, and they are color coded intentionally. So the top tools are in common with leads and cases. So Web 2, leader case, assignment, auto response. We already talked through all of those. Two more tools just for cases, email to case escalation rules. And these orange ones, we talked about one of them, big deal alerts, that threshold for the amount and probability for opportunities. And then we have update reminders that can be used for opportunities as well. So this is almost like a report subscription. Maybe managers want to get updates on their team's opportunities. Did the amount change? Did they log an activity? Stuff like that. We already talked about validation. All of these tools down here are automation tools that can be applied to any object. And I say can be maybe loosely, because Workflow and Process Builder are in the process of being retired. Currently, you cannot create any new workflows or any new processes. But what we can do is still keep our existing workflow rules and existing processes active in our org. They're still functioning, but we do want to start thinking about how we get them into flow. Rose has a request. NTO has a lot of manual processes that take quite a bit of time to complete. Are there automations we can put in place to increase speed and efficiency? What a great idea. What a great question from Rose. So again, I don't want to spend a lot of time on workflows or process builder, but you do need to know high level how they work and what they do. So workflow's been around for a while, kind of like a workhorse of Salesforce automation. It is a single if-then statement. So when does it evaluate? We have our rule criteria. If this is true, then do this. And the then could be immediate actions, could also be time-dependent actions. So right away, do something. A day later, do something else. Workflow can only automate 4 actions. It can do a task, an email alert, a field update, and an outbound message. Only 4 actions that Workflow can automate. A task is your to-do item. An email alert goes to a person. Field update, updating a field in the system. An outbound message is a coded API message that goes to another system. So this is a very simple way to put it, but email alert goes to a person, outbound message goes to another system. And I actually remember these actions in a different order. I remember FTEO, and I remember that because in these actions, field updates run first. There's 2 stars there. Field updates run first in the order of the actions. But otherwise, we don't get to control the actions in a workflow. And big thing to remember, it's a single if statement. You get one set of criteria. You can have multiple actions, multiple immediate, multiple time dependent, but one set of criteria. Then came along Process Builder, and this was the exciting tool for a while. Process Builder can be like a series of if-then statements. If this is true, then do this. If it's not, look at the next thing. If this is true, then do something else. Like workflow, we can have multiple immediate actions, multiple time dependent, but it's still pretty linear. If it's this, then this. If it's this, then this, and so on. We can click and drag to reorder these criteria nodes to control the order of our actions. Couldn't do that with workflow, but we can't really do complex logic. Flow does that a lot better than Process Builder. Process Builder could never do an outbound message. Workflow could. Flow can now. Process Builder couldn't. You had to use Call Apex to get similar functionality. I mentioned you can reorder the criteria nodes. They execute in the order that we put them in the process. Can't reuse them in a process like we could with workflow actions. And if something goes wrong, the admin gets a fault email. Process Builder can automate more for us than workflows can. It can do a task or create any related record, can do a field update, can do an email alert, but can also do things like post to chatter, kick off an approval process, kick off a flow. So it can do more. We'll see a comparison of actions in a moment. What about use cases for flow? And I know it gives use cases and it lists Process Builder in here. Let's focus on the flow side of things. So when would we use flow? Well, it used to be the case that we would turn to flow anytime we needed a screen flow. Anytime we needed that wizard-like experience is when we would turn to flow, walking them through a series of screens, kind of like a choose your own adventure book. You get here, you might jump ahead, or you might keep moving, or you might circle back and check something again. If we want to do something automatic in the background, so we can use record triggered flows. If this happens, automatically do this. When someone creates a record, automatically create another record for them. We can connect to an external system. You can have a flow kicked off by a platform event message that comes from outside of Salesforce. Uses something called a publisher subscriber architecture. Event message comes from outside of Salesforce, it kicks off a flow. That's something you could do with Process Builder as well. We can add automation on our pages. So one of the ways that we can surface a screen flow is through a standard Lightning component. Kind of plug it in on your home page, plug it in on a record page using the Lightning App Builder. We could also have it as a utility bar, which shows up as a docked footer in your Lightning apps. We also have the ability with flows to build reusable kind of modular flows. So a subflow, one flow calls another flow at runtime. And if you have a series of things that you need to automate in different scenarios, well, that's a really good use case to build that as a subflow. So it can be plugged into other flows and reused, so you don't have to recreate the infrastructure every time. Our flow types. When I create a new flow, the first thing it's going to ask me is what type of flow are you creating? And the type of flow I select is going to determine the available elements that I can pull into my flow. Elements are like the main building blocks in your flow. Screen flow, it's easier to tell when you need a screen flow. Anytime I want to collect information from my users in a separate interface or surface information to them, that is a screen flow. That's my wizard-like experience. Record-triggered flows are kicked off by a change to a record. If it's created, if it's updated, if it's deleted. And these replace what we previously did with Workflow and Process Builder. They run implicitly in the background. Schedule-triggered flow runs on a calendar date and time. So I have a schedule-triggered flow I built in my org every Friday morning, run through, check people's certification records, and see if any of them need to be updated. Every Friday morning we do this, calendar date and time. Platform event, we saw that one in the use cases, kicked off by a platform event message received from outside of Salesforce. An auto launch flow can be kicked off by something like a REST API, Apex, or another flow. So historically, we used auto launch flows as something kicked off by a process with Process Builder before we really worked with record triggered flows. Now, auto launch flows are commonly used as those subflows, flows that I can plug in different places. And then the newest flow type that's available is a record triggered orchestration. And this is more of a user element. It's a little bit more user centric than our other flow types. It's made up of a series of stages and steps within those stages. So you might have someone come in, they log a task, the orchestration continues, a different person comes in, they do something else, kind of coordinates those different stages with multiple users. How do I build a flow? Well, first of all, I need a permission. I think it's just called manage flows now. I think that's the old label for the permission. And flows are built with a combination of resources and elements. A colleague of mine a long time ago, she compared a flow to a cake. And your resources are your raw ingredients, your sugar, your flour, your butter. You can think of them as placeholders. I use my resources to park information to later use throughout my flow. And the resources are referenced by elements in my flow. So I need both of them to work together. Elements would be like the layers of my cake. So one layer, the filling, the frosting. And elements are really the main building blocks of your flow. They take some kind of action. So I have here a series of screens that we get connected together, and we connect them to the start to determine how the flow is kicked off. When you are working with your data elements, doing things like creating records, updating records, deleting, or some of your action elements as well, kicking off an approval, sending an email alert, there is a chance that something might go wrong. So a fault is an exception. It's an error. Something goes wrong in your flow. And when we have a fault in our flow, we want to handle that within the flow. So the bottom, what we see is the default fault message. An unhandled fault has occurred in this flow. But in screen flows in particular, we want to give them more valuable information. And we can have a separate screen that shows them what we call a detailed fault message. Instead of the generic and unhandled fault has occurred in this flow, the error message could be, hey, a required field is missing. You can look up the exception code if you want to, but we're giving them more context, the detailed fault message. When you build a flow, as is the case with anything in Salesforce, we want to test it. And Flow has some nice built-in testing and debugging features that I always recommend taking advantage of. You can do this directly from the Flow Builder tool, and we can experience the flow as our end users if it's a screen flow. And if it's a record triggered flow or screen flow, we also get the debug details along the right-hand side of the screen. And that's what you see on my screen right now. The debug details shows me how it started. We tried to get records. We successfully found the record. We did another get records. We successfully found this one. It's called Acme. And it shows me how the flow is progressing. And if an element in my flow fails, the debug details will tell me where it failed and what went wrong. Sometimes it takes a little bit of investigation to figure out the error, but it's really helpful to have those details on the right-hand side as it's progressing through. So I always recommend debugging flows before they're deployed, before they're activated. And we also want to be mindful of governor limits. This is a more advanced concept, and I don't want to focus on it here. But in general, being mindful of governor limits means building efficient flows. If I'm creating multiple group memberships for a public group, I want to do one create records instead of creating records separate times. So just being efficient helps us be mindful of those limits. This says deploying a flow. But another way that I really think of this is how do we make the flow available to our end users? So think of those flows that run in the background, an auto launch flow, a record triggered flow, a schedule triggered flow. Once we activate that, and then that means that those apply. Kicked off by the schedule, kicked off by the record change, whatever that is. But with screen flows, we have to do another step. We activate it, and then we figure out how do we surface this screen flow to our end users? How do we make it available for our end users to interact with? And I know it's a little bit jumbled here with the text. So one way we can make a flow available as admins, we can have a custom button or link. We can use a custom quick action or simply pull a standard Lightning component onto the page with the Lightning App Builder. That's what I mentioned before. We can deploy it as a utility item. The one consideration for utility items is that they're desktop only, but in certain cases, it might make sense to have that flow. You just quickly open it from a docked footer in the app. Again, it can be kicked off previously from a process, and the debug logs allow us to see the progression of the flow through the different elements. If something does go wrong with the flow, which if you all build flows, and as you start to, if you don't already, I hope you learn to build flows, you will get flow fault emails. It's a regular part of working with flows. Sometimes something's wrong with the flow itself. Sometimes it's something the flow interacted with, but not uncommon to get those fault emails.